The morning sun painted golden streaks across the moving truck as another box made its way into the two-story house on Maple Street. The new homeowner couldn't help but smile, watching his dream unfold before his eyes. After 15 years of grinding away at his computer, debugging code until his eyes burned, and saving every extra penny, he had finally done it. Bought his own piece of the American dream in one of the most sought-after neighborhoods in town. The house wasn't massive, but it was perfect. Red brick exterior, a small front porch just big enough for a couple of chairs, and a backyard where he could already picture weekend barbecues and quiet morning coffees. The previous owners had maintained it beautifully, and the moment he walked through the front door during the open house, he knew this was home. But the real cherry on top sat in the driveway. A brand new Tesla Model 3, gleaming under the spring sun. The car represented everything he had worked for since arriving in this country as a wide-eyed kid with his parents. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every instant noodle dinner during his early career. It had all led to this moment. As he carried another box inside, an elderly couple walking their golden retriever waved from the sidewalk. He waved back, his heart warming at their friendly smiles. A few houses down, kids were playing basketball in their driveway, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The neighborhood had that perfect mix of established families and young professionals that the real estate agent had described. Inside, he started unpacking his home office first. Old habits die hard, and he knew he'd need his workspace set up before anything else. As he positioned his desk near the window overlooking the tree-lined street, his phone buzzed with a message from his parents. "Have you eaten? Don't forget to take breaks while unpacking." He chuckled, typing back a quick response to assure them he'd ordered lunch. The afternoon passed in a blur of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. Each item he unpacked felt like another piece of his life falling into place. His collection of computer science books found their home on the built-in shelves. The family photos, showing 3 generations of smiling faces, went up on the living room walls. Even his old college trophy from the programming competition made it onto a shelf, dusty but proud. As evening approached, he stepped onto his front porch, a cup of green tea warming his hands. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, and the sound of crickets filled the air. A few neighbors were returning from work, garage doors opening and closing in a suburban symphony. He took a deep breath, taking in the moment. This wasn't just a house or a neighborhood. It was the beginning of a new chapter. His phone buzzed again, this time with a welcome message from the neighborhood association. They were having a block party that weekend, and everyone was invited. Perfect timing, he thought, already looking forward to meeting more of his neighbors. Maybe he'd bring his mom's famous dumplings. Food had always been the best conversation starter in his experience. Looking out at his car one last time before heading inside, he felt a surge of pride. Tomorrow would be his first day driving it to the office, where he'd recently been promoted to lead software engineer. Everything was falling into place, piece by piece, dream by dream. As he locked up for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a new home. It was the beginning of something special. 3 months into living in his new home, small changes began creeping into the peaceful routine he'd established. It started with something so subtle he almost missed it. The way his next-door neighbor would suddenly turn away when their eyes met while collecting the morning paper. At first, he brushed it off as imagination, maybe even shyness. After all, everyone else in the neighborhood had been nothing but welcoming. The block party, his first weekend, had been wonderful. Kids running around with popsicle-stained smiles, the retired teacher from 2 doors down sharing her legendary potato salad recipe, and even the local fire department showing up with their truck for the children to explore. His mom's dumplings had been a hit, with several neighbors asking for the recipe. That day, he'd felt like he'd found his place in this community. But as autumn leaves started painting the neighborhood in warm colors, the strange behavior from his neighbor became impossible to ignore. The man, who lived alone in the blue house next door, had started muttering under his breath whenever they crossed paths. Sometimes it was about maintaining standards or keeping things the way they should be. Other times, the comments were about property values and certain people changing the neighborhood's character. One evening, while tending to his newly planted garden, a hobby he'd picked up to help reduce the stress of his coding job, he overheard his neighbor loudly complaining on his phone about these people moving in and changing everything. The words stung, but he focused on his tomato plants, remembering his father's advice about staying true to yourself no matter what others think. The situation grew more uncomfortable when he noticed his neighbor taking photos of his house and car. Not just once or twice, but repeatedly, usually when he had family visiting or when he was washing his Tesla in the driveway. The clicks of the phone camera were becoming a familiar weekend soundtrack. During neighborhood council meetings, which he attended regularly to stay involved in community decisions, his neighbor would sit in the back, arms crossed, glaring whenever he offered suggestions for community improvements. His idea for a community garden had been well received by most residents, but his neighbor had loudly questioned whether outsiders should be making changes to our neighborhood. Despite the growing tension, he found strength in the support of other neighbors. The retired couple with a golden retriever often brought him homemade cookies, saying they were grateful to have such a responsible young homeowner on their street. The family across the way invited him to their weekly game nights, where their teenagers eagerly asked for his advice about pursuing careers in technology. He kept his routine, refusing to let one person's prejudice change how he lived his life. Every morning, he'd wave to the joggers passing by, chat with the school kids waiting for their bus near his driveway, and tend to his growing garden. His home security system gave him peace of mind, though he never thought he'd need one in such a friendly neighborhood. As winter approached, he noticed his neighbor spending more time alone, often sitting on his porch late into the night, nursing what looked like a bottle wrapped in paper. Sometimes, he could hear angry phone conversations about layoffs and company downsizing. Part of him felt sympathy. Losing a job was tough, and he knew how it could affect someone's whole outlook on life. Still, he kept his distance while remaining cordial, always offering a polite nod even when it wasn't returned. His parents had taught him that maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice was its own form of strength. Besides, he had more important things to focus on. His garden was thriving, his career was soaring, and most of his neighbors had become good friends. Life was good, even if one dark cloud lingered on the horizon. The morning started like any other Tuesday. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. He had an early meeting, so he was up before his usual time, sipping his morning coffee while reviewing some code on his laptop. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional sound of early birds chirping breaking the silence. As he gathered his things for work, he noticed a text from his team about the upcoming software launch. Taking one last gulp of coffee, he grabbed his keys and headed for the front door. The moment he stepped onto his porch, something felt off. The morning air carried an unusual tension, and he could hear worried whispers from his neighbors across the street. His heart dropped when he turned toward his driveway. His Tesla, his pride and joy that represented years of hard work, was unrecognizable. The windows were shattered, glass scattered across the concrete like diamond dust in the morning sun. Deep scratches ran along the sides, marring the once pristine paint. All four tires were flat, and the side mirrors hung limply, barely attached. His hands trembled as he took in the damage, but it was the crude messages scratched into the hood that made his stomach turn. Words of hate, of ignorance, stared back at him. The security camera he'd installed months ago blinked steadily above, and he knew it had captured everything. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. The retired couple who always brought him cookies were the first to reach him, their faces etched with concern and anger. "We heard noises last night," the wife said, her voice shaking. "We called the police when we saw what was happening." More neighbors gathered, their shock turning to outrage as they saw the extent of the damage. Someone had already called the police again, and sirens could be heard in the distance. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from concerned neighbors who had already heard about the incident through the community group chat. The security footage would later show what happened. His next-door neighbor, clearly intoxicated, had stumbled out of his house around 2 a.m. The cameras captured everything: the stumbling walk, the angry muttering, and the 30 minutes of destructive rage that followed. The neighbor's words, caught clearly on the audio, left no doubt about the motivation behind the vandalism. As police officers arrived and began taking statements, he stood quietly, answering questions with a calm that surprised even himself. Inside, his emotions churned like a storm: anger, hurt, disappointment, and something else he couldn't quite name. The officers were professional and thorough, documenting every scratch, every dent, every hateful word. The neighborhood association president arrived, still in her mourning robe, her face a mix of fury and determination. "This is not who we are," she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is not what our community stands for." Other neighbors nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears, others making phone calls to local news stations. As the morning wore on, more support arrived. A neighbor who owned a body shop offered to handle the repairs at cost. Another neighbor, a lawyer, handed him her card, offering to help with any legal proceedings. The local coffee shop owner from around the corner brought hot coffee and breakfast for everyone, refusing to accept payment. Standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of his car, but also by the overwhelming support of his community, he felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, but it was being tempered by something else. A realization that for every person who acted out of hate, there were dozens more who would stand up against it. His phone buzzed again, his boss, telling him to take all the time he needed, that the team would cover his meetings. As he watched the police lead his neighbor away in handcuffs, still shouting and stumbling, he didn't feel the satisfaction he thought he would. Instead, he felt a strange mix of pity and determination. This incident would change things, but not in the way his neighbor had intended. That evening, after the police had gone and the crowd of neighbors had dispersed, he sat alone in his living room, staring at the family photos on his wall. The house felt unusually quiet, almost too quiet, giving his thoughts too much space to echo. The events of the morning kept playing in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. His phone lay silent on the coffee table, though it had been buzzing nonstop all day. Friends, family, and colleagues had been calling and messaging since the news spread. His parents wanted to drive over immediately, but he convinced them to wait. He needed time to think, to process, to decide what to do next. Looking out his window, he could see the empty space in his driveway where his car should have been. The tow truck had taken it to the body shop hours ago. The neighbor's house next door was dark and empty too, its owner spending the night in a jail cell, sobering up and facing the consequences of his actions. As anger bubbled up again, he remembered his grandmother's voice, clear as day. She'd always told him stories from the old country about how their family had faced hardship with dignity. Meeting hatred with more hatred, she used to say, is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. He smiled slightly, remembering how she'd always follow that up by stuffing his pockets with candies, no matter how old he got. His tea had gone cold, but he sipped it anyway. The police had given him options. He could press charges, the evidence was clear, multiple witnesses had come forward, and the security footage left no room for doubt. The district attorney's office had already called, talking about hate crime enhancements and making an example to deter others. But something kept nagging at him. He remembered the conversations he'd overheard in recent weeks. His neighbor's angry phone calls about losing his job, about struggling to pay bills, about his world falling apart. The man's actions were inexcusable, but they seemed to come from a place of fear and desperation rather than pure hatred. Standing up, he walked to his home office and sat at his desk. The computer screen glowed softly in the dim room. Instead of opening his usual coding projects, he opened a blank document and began to type. Words flowed out of him about his family's journey to this country, about their dreams, struggles, and triumphs. He wrote about his parents working multiple jobs to put him through college, about the neighbors who'd welcomed him with open arms, about the community that had rallied around him today. As midnight approached, he found himself writing about understanding, about how fear often masquerades as hate, about how communities grow stronger by embracing change rather than fighting it. The letter was becoming something more than just a response to vandalism. It was evolving into a bridge, a hand extended across a divide that seemed uncrossable. His grandmother's other favorite saying came to mind. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to your enemies, but standing up for them when they've lost their way. He'd never fully understood that until now, sitting in his quiet house, wondering if real change could come from choosing understanding over vengeance. The night grew deeper, but sleep felt far away. He kept typing, refining his words, making sure each sentence carried the right balance of honesty and hope. This wasn't just about him anymore, or even about his neighbor. It was about something bigger, about what kind of community they wanted to be, about how people could learn to live together despite their differences. Tomorrow, he would have decisions to make, legal papers to sign, insurance forms to fill out, statements to give. But tonight, in the quiet of his home office, surrounded by the gentle hum of his computer and memories of his grandmother's wisdom, he was finding his way towards something that felt more important than justice: understanding. The neighborhood association meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6:30, the community center was already packed. People spoke in hushed whispers, stealing glances at him as he walked in, letter in hand. The events of the past few days had shaken the community, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. He'd spent 3 days writing and rewriting his letter, making sure every word carried the right weight. His hands weren't shaking anymore, but his heart beat a little faster as he waited for his turn to speak. The association president had given him a special slot at the beginning of the meeting, understanding the importance of what he needed to say. Looking around the room, he saw familiar faces: the couple with the golden retriever who'd brought him soup yesterday, the young family whose kids had made him a "we're sorry" card covered in glitter, the retired teacher who'd organized a neighborhood watch after the incident. Their support had been overwhelming, but what he was about to do might surprise them all. When he stood up to speak, the room fell silent. The letter felt heavy in his hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. He cleared his throat and began reading. Dear neighbors, his voice was steady, carrying to every corner of the packed room. I came to this country when I was 5 years old. My earliest memory is my mother telling me that America was a place where anyone could build a better life if they worked hard enough. She was right. He shared stories about his family's journey, his father working 2 jobs while learning English at night, his mother starting a small alterations business from their tiny apartment, his own journey through public schools and into the tech industry. With each word, he could see heads nodding, eyes softening. When I bought my house here, he continued, it wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about belonging somewhere, about being part of community. What happened to my car hurt deeply, not because of the damage, but because it made me question that sense of belonging. The room was so quiet you could hear the old heating system humming in the background. Some people were wiping tears, others held hands or nodded in understanding. But then something amazing happened. You, my neighbors, showed me what community really means. Your support reminded me that one person's actions don't define a whole neighborhood. And that's why I've made a decision that might surprise you. He paused, taking a deep breath. Instead of pressing charges, I want to host a neighborhood dinner. Not just any dinner, but one where we can all share our stories, our cultures, our fears, and our hopes. Where we can learn from each other and grow stronger together. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected. He could see confusion, surprise, and then, gradually, understanding dawn on faces around the room. I've learned that sometimes fear and ignorance drive people to do harmful things. But I've also learned that the best way to fight fear is with understanding, and the best way to combat ignorance is with connection. My grandmother always said that food brings people together like nothing else can. As he continued reading, explaining his vision for monthly cultural exchange dinners and community building initiatives, the energy in the room began to shift. What had started as a meeting about a hate crime was transforming into something else. A conversation about hope, about change, about building bridges instead of walls. By the time he finished speaking, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of shock or anger anymore, but rather the quiet that comes when people are processing something unexpected, something that makes them think differently about their own beliefs and assumptions. The first hand that went up wasn't to ask a question. It was to volunteer to help organize the dinner. Then another hand, and another. Soon, the meeting had transformed into an impromptu planning session, with people offering their homes, their cooking skills, their stories. Word spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By the next morning, his letter had been shared hundreds of times on local community forums. People weren't just sharing it. They were adding their own stories, their own experiences of facing prejudice or learning to overcome their biases. The simple neighborhood post had sparked something much bigger than anyone expected. The local coffee shop owner, who'd been in the community for 30 years, posted about how his Italian grandparents had faced discrimination when they first opened the business. Now he was offering to cater the first cultural exchange dinner for free. "It's time we acknowledge our past to build a better future," he wrote, and the comments section filled with support. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. The high school principal reached out, asking if he would consider speaking to the students about resilience and community building. A local news reporter left 3 messages, wanting to cover the story. But what touched him most were the private messages from people in the neighborhood he'd never met before. An elderly woman from 3 streets over sent him a long email about how she'd been scared of change when different families started moving into the neighborhood. "Your letter made me realize I've been looking at everything all wrong," she wrote. "Instead of fearing change, I should be celebrating how our community is growing richer with each new family." The body shop working on his car called with surprising news. When word got out about what happened, local auto parts suppliers had donated materials for the repairs. A group of high school students from the technical program had asked if they could help with the restoration as part of their community service project. His car was becoming a symbol of community healing. At the grocery store, people he'd never spoken to before stopped to chat. A young mother told him how she'd used his letter to explain to her kids about standing up to bullying in a way that creates change instead of more conflict. The store manager insisted on contributing drinks and snacks for the upcoming dinner. Social media caught fire with the story. A local artist created a digital illustration of diverse hands joining together, inspired by the letter. It went viral, shared by community groups across the country dealing with similar issues. People began using it as their profile pictures, a quiet statement of solidarity and hope. The neighborhood association's website crashed from too many visitors after they posted about the upcoming dinner. Other communities started reaching out, asking for advice on starting their own cultural exchange programs. What started as one man's response to hatred was becoming a blueprint for community transformation. Most surprising were the messages from people admitting their own prejudices and wanting to do better. "Your response made me question my own biases," wrote one neighbor. "I've lived here for 40 years, and I've probably been part of the problem without realizing it. I want to be part of the solution now." The retired teacher who lived down the street started a Stories of Our Community blog, collecting tales from different families about their journeys to the neighborhood. Children drew pictures of their favorite things about living in a diverse community, creating an impromptu art gallery in the community center's windows. Local businesses began putting up signs supporting unity and diversity, not because anyone asked them to, but because they wanted to be part of the change. The hardware store owner, a quiet man who rarely got involved in community events, offered his parking lot for an outdoor movie night where they could show films from different cultures. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating. The forecast for the upcoming dinner promised a perfect spring evening. As RSVPs poured in, it became clear they would need a bigger venue. The high school offered their cafeteria, and student volunteers signed up to help serve food and organize activities for kids. What had started as a response to hate had sparked a movement of love and understanding. People weren't just talking about change anymore. They were actively working to create it, one conversation, one gesture, one meal at a time. The bail hearing was set for a Wednesday morning. Nobody expected what happened next. The neighbor who had vandalized the car walked into the courtroom looking like a different person. Gone was the angry, drunk man from that terrible night. Instead, he stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes red from what looked like sleepless nights. When given a chance to speak, his voice cracked with emotion. "I've had a week in jail to think about what I did," he began, hands trembling as he held a crumpled piece of paper. "I lost my job of 20 years, and instead of facing that like a man, I blamed others for my problems. I turned into someone I don't even recognize anymore." In the gallery, people from the neighborhood listened intently. Some had come to support the victim, others out of curiosity, but all were struck by the raw honesty in the man's voice. "When I read the letter my neighbor wrote," he continued, wiping his eyes, "I felt ashamed. Here was someone I'd hurt so badly, showing more concern for our community, more wisdom about what makes America great than I ever did. I always talked about traditional values. Well, forgiveness and understanding are the most traditional values I know." The judge leaned forward, clearly interested in this unexpected turn of events. The courthouse had seen many apologies before, but something about this one felt different. "I can't undo what I did," the neighbor said, his voice stronger now. "But I can try to make it right. I'm asking for a chance to show that people can change. I've already signed up for counseling. I want to learn about other cultures, about my own biases. I want to help organize these community dinners I've been hearing about." Looking directly at his neighbor for the first time since that night, he added, "I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned it. But I want to try to be the kind of neighbor this community deserves." The victim stood up then, surprising everyone. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I'd like to speak." The judge nodded, and a hush fell over the courtroom. "I believe in second chances. We're planning our first community dinner next week. If my neighbor is serious about making amends, I think that would be a good place to start." The judge, who'd seen countless cases of neighbor disputes turn bitter, seemed moved. After consulting with both parties' lawyers, she announced a unique resolution. Community service hours would be spent helping organize cultural exchange events. Mandatory counseling would include cultural sensitivity training, and restitution would cover all damages. Outside the courthouse, beneath a bright spring sky, two neighbors stood face to face. The handshake they shared wasn't for the news cameras that had gathered. It was a genuine moment between two people finding their way back to humanity. "I'm good with my hands," the neighbor offered awkwardly. "Used to do body work. Maybe I could help restore your car." The offer hung in the air for a moment before being met with a nod and a small smile. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood group chat. The story was no longer about vandalism or hate. It was about transformation. Local businesses that had been hesitant to get involved now stepped forward. The hardware store offered supplies for community projects. The local diner promised to help with cooking lessons for the cultural exchange program. That weekend, neighbors watched as two men worked side by side in a driveway, carefully removing dents from a car's panels. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that comes when people are focused on building something new. As the sun set, more neighbors brought out chairs, drinks, and snacks. Someone started playing soft music. Children rode their bikes nearby, their laughter mixing with the gentle sounds of restoration work. What had started as a car repair was turning into an impromptu block party. Looking around at the gathering crowd, At the mixture of faces all sharing food and stories in his driveway, he realized something profound. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest acts of understanding. 1 year later, the neighborhood looked different, though not in ways you could easily photograph. The changes were in the small things: the way people greeted each other on morning walks, how children from different backgrounds played together in front yards, the sounds of various languages mixing with laughter at community gatherings. The monthly cultural exchange dinners had become legendary. What started in the high school cafeteria had grown so popular they now rotated between different venues. The local community center, 3 churches, and even the public library had offered their spaces. Each month brought new stories, new flavors, and new connections. His formerly vandalized Tesla now sparkled in the driveway, completely restored. The repair had become a community project, with his former neighbor leading the work. They'd spent weekends working on it together, their conversations moving from awkward silence to genuine exchange. Other neighbors would stop by, bringing coffee and snacks, turning repair sessions into impromptu gatherings. The story had spread far beyond their little community. News outlets had covered it, not for the initial act of hatred, but for what happened afterward. Other neighborhoods across the country had reached out, asking for advice on starting their own cultural exchange programs. The retired teacher who'd started the community blog was now helping other communities document their own journeys toward understanding. The high school had made real changes too. They'd started a cultural awareness club, and students were leading initiatives to make new families feel welcome. The formerly angry neighbor, now sober for a year, often spoke to students about how unchecked biases and fear can poison a person's heart, and how it's never too late to change. The neighborhood association meetings, once sparsely attended, now needed extra chairs. People didn't come just to discuss maintenance issues anymore. They came to share ideas, to plan events, to be part of something bigger than themselves. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, co-chaired by the 2 former adversaries, had become a model for other communities. Local businesses had transformed too. The coffee shop now featured monthly displays highlighting different cultures. The hardware store offered its community board for posting welcome messages in multiple languages. The local diner had expanded its menu to include dishes from around the world, with recipes contributed by neighbors. Even the physical appearance of the neighborhood reflected the change. Gardens bloomed with plants from different parts of the world, shared between neighbors during garden club meetings. The community center's walls display artwork from local artists of all backgrounds, telling stories of their heritage through colors and shapes. One particularly touching moment came during the 1-year anniversary of the incident. Instead of remembering the hatred, the community organized a celebration of change. In the park, under strings of lights, hundreds of neighbors gathered to share meals, stories, and dreams for the future. The elderly woman who'd initially feared change now hosted weekly tea parties, inviting different neighbors each time to share their life stories. She'd learned to cook dishes from 3 different cultures and proudly served them alongside her traditional sugar cookies. Children in the neighborhood had perhaps shown the most beautiful transformation. They'd created their own tradition of birthday parties where each child would share something from their family's culture. Parents watched in amazement as kids naturally embraced differences, finding joy in learning about each other's traditions. The car that was once a target of hate had become a symbol of transformation. Sometimes, during community events, people would gather around it, not to remember the vandalism, but to marvel at how far they'd come. The restored paint gleamed under the sun, showing no traces of the hatred that had once marked it. As he drove to work each morning, he would wave to his neighbors, all of them. The man who had once vandalized his car would often be out walking his new rescue dog, both of them looking healthier and happier. They'd exchange nods, sometimes stop for a quick chat about the next community event or the weekend's plans. The neighborhood had learned that true change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from small, daily choices to understand each other better. Every shared meal, every conversation, every moment of choosing understanding over anger had added up to something remarkable. a community that didn't just talk about inclusion, but lived it every day.